The air at Arlington National Cemetery hung heavy with a silence that felt ancient and sacred, a stark contrast to the restless energy of the tourist group shuffling along the plaza. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue, casting sharp shadows that seemed to deepen the solemnity of the place. Yet for some, the gravity of the tomb of the unknown soldier was lost, replaced by the trivial pursuit of a perfect vacation photo. Among them was Mark, a man in his late 30s, whose floral shirt was as loud as his voice. He viewed the world through the lens of his smartphone, reducing hallowed ground to mere background scenery for his next social media post. He, along with his small entourage of equally oblivious friends, saw the meticulously choreographed changing of the guard as little more than a theatrical performance, a quaint piece of American pageantry designed for their entertainment. They whispered and snickered, their sounds like sharp stones skipping across a placid lake. A few feet away, a family tried to absorb the moment, the father quietly explaining to his young son the significance of the soldiers who lay in eternal rest, their identities known only to God. They felt the palpable reverence, the unspoken weight of sacrifice that permeated the very stones beneath their feet. But their quiet contemplation was repeatedly punctured by the tourists' careless chatter. The father's jaw tightened with each burst of laughter from Mark's group. He wanted to say something, to remind them where they were, but the words caught in his throat. He was just a visitor, and confrontation wasn't his nature. Instead, he tried to shield his son from the disruption, pulling him closer and whispering about honor and duty, hoping his own words could drown out the noise and preserve the sanctity of their visit. He watched as the tomb guard, a sentinel of discipline, continued his patrol, his movements precise and unwavering, seemingly oblivious to the disrespect festering in the crowd. The tomb guard, Sergeant Kalin, was anything but oblivious. Every whisper, every stifled giggle registered in his highly attuned senses. His focus, however, was a laser beam, honed by countless hours of training to remain fixed on his duty. His face, a mask of stoic resolve, betrayed none of the internal monologue that assessed the crowd's every move. He was the living embodiment of the tomb's inscription, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." His presence was meant to be a silent, powerful testament to that honor. He was more than a soldier. He was a guardian, a keeper of a sacred trust. The polished marble of the plaza reflected his immaculate uniform, the sharp creases in his trousers, a testament to the discipline that governed his entire existence. He knew the line between spectator and participant, between reverence and ridicule, was a fine one, and he could feel this particular group inching closer to crossing it. Mark, emboldened by the guard's apparent indifference, raised his voice slightly, narrating his observations to his friends with a mocking tone. "Look at this guy. He's like a robot. Do you think he even blinks?" He chuckled, zooming in with his phone. His friend, a woman named Chloe, giggled in response. "I bet it's all for show. They probably go for beers afterward and laugh about all the tourists they fooled." This comment, though meant for her friends, carried on the still air, reaching the ears of others who had come to pay their respects. A veteran standing nearby, his hat held respectfully over his heart, shot them a glare that could have melted steel, but it went unnoticed. The tourists were in their own world, a bubble of self-importance that rendered them blind to the sacred space they were desecrating with their casual disdain. The tension was a low hum, a building pressure that only those attuned to the cemetery's solemn rhythm could truly feel. The conflict was brewing, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the subtle yet profound clash of two opposing worlds. On one side stood the tomb guard, a symbol of unwavering respect, discipline, and the solemn memory of the fallen. His every step was a tribute, his silence a powerful oration on sacrifice. On the other side was Mark and his friends, representing a modern brand of tourism, where nothing is sacred and everything is content. Their laughter and casual mockery were not just noise, they were an active erosion of the very principles the tomb stood for. The guard's path was a straight, unyielding line, a physical representation of his duty. Mark's group, in their restless movement and careless positioning, threatened to intersect that line, not just physically but symbolically, challenging the unwritten, yet absolute, rules of this hallowed ground. Sergeant Kalen made the turn at the edge of the mat. His steel-toed shoes clicked against the stone with a sound that was both sharp and mournful, a rhythm that had echoed across that plaza for decades. He saw the group out of the corner of his eye, their bright clothes a jarring splash of color against the pristine white of the tomb. He heard the man's latest jest about his perfectly polished rifle. He knew a moment was approaching, a moment where his role would shift from silent sentinel to active enforcer of decorum. It was a transition he did not relish, but would execute without hesitation. The honor of the unknowns was paramount, and the public's adherence to that standard was non-negotiable. The sun beat down, the crowd held its breath, and the stage was set for a lesson in respect that would be delivered with military precision. The atmosphere grew thicker as the formal changing of the guard ceremony commenced. The relief commander's Seul voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative, reciting the orders that had been spoken countless times before. For most, this was a moment of heightened solemnity, a time to stand still and witness a tradition steeped in honor. For Mark, it was prime time for content creation. He pushed slightly forward, angling his phone to capture the intricate rifle. Inspection. "This is the best part," he whispered loudly to Chloe, who was now live-streaming the event to a handful of online viewers. "It's like a Broadway play, but with real guns. You guys gotta see the choreography." His commentary was a running monologue of flippant remarks, each one chipping away at the respectful silence the other visitors were trying to maintain. He was no longer just a spectator. He had become a performer in his own right, with the sacred ceremony as his unwilling backdrop. The veteran who had glared at him earlier now stood rigid, his disgust palpable. Sergeant Kalen, having completed his patrol, stood at attention, his gaze fixed forward, seemingly locked on a distant point. But his awareness was total. He could hear the hushed narration from the tourist, the digital chime of a notification from someone's phone, and the shuffling of feet as people shifted their weight. He had been trained for this, to exist in a state of heightened perception while maintaining an exterior of absolute stillness. He knew the type well, the ones who saw the uniform but not the man, the ceremony but not the sacrifice it represented. They came and went, a constant stream of ignorance and apathy. Yet his duty was not to judge, but to guard. He was a living monument, a human shield protecting the memory of the fallen from the erosion of time and the carelessness of the living. His stillness was a form of energy, a coiled spring of potential action, waiting for the precise moment when intervention would become necessary. The incitement came not with a shout but with a laugh. As the sentinel and the relief commander performed the precise 21-step inspection of the weapon, a process filled with symbolic gravity, Mark let out a short, sharp chuckle. "He almost dropped it," he exclaimed, loud enough for several rows of people to hear. It was a fabrication. The rifle had been handled with flawless precision. But the comment served its purpose. It shattered the fragile reverence of the moment. A few of his friends tittered in response, and the bubble of disrespect expanded. The father, with the young son, flinched, pulling the boy even closer, as if to physically shield him from the vulgarity of the sound. The act was a clear and deliberate challenge, a piece of graffiti scrawled across a masterpiece. It was a direct affront, not just to the ceremony, but to the very concept of honor that the tomb guard embodied. This was the tipping point. The Etas, laughter, sharp and mocking, was a direct violation of the sanctity of the moment. It was a sound that did not belong in this place, an acoustic sacrilege. Sergeant Kalen's focus, which had been a wide net of awareness, now narrowed to a single point, the source of the disruption. He didn't move a muscle. His posture remained unchanged, but an imperceptible shift occurred. The Guardian was now preparing to act. His training had prepared him for any threat, be it physical or, as in this case, conceptual. The threat was disrespect, an insidious corrosion that, if left unchecked, would undermine the very foundation of what he was. There to protect, he had given the silent warnings, his imposing presence, the palpable solemnity of the grounds, the glares from other visitors. All had been ignored. Now, a more direct approach was required. The development of the tension was Swift and palpable, the laughter died down, but it left a vacuum, a ringing silence that was more uncomfortable than the noise it replaced. The crowd, which had been a collection of individuals, now felt like a single entity, holding its collective breath. Those who had been annoyed by Mark's behavior now watched with a sense of grim anticipation. They could feel the change in the air, the subtle shift in the ceremony's energy. Mark, however, seemed oblivious, a smirk still playing on his lips. He believed he had gotten away with it, that his comment was just another harmless joke. He failed to understand that on this ground there were no harmless jokes. He mistook the guard's disciplined stillness for inaction, his silence for tolerance. He was about to learn in a very public and unforgettable way that the rules here were absolute. The relief commander completed his inspection and took his post. The new sentinel, Sergeant Kalen, began his solitary walk. 21 steps, pause for 21 seconds, turn, repeat. Each step was deliberate, a resonant beat on the drum of remembrance. As he paced, his path would take him directly in front of the disruptive group. It was not a coincidence, it was part of the design of his patrol. It gave him proximity and presence. The crowd watched, a silent jury awaiting the verdict. Mark raised his phone again, ready to capture another clip for his story, completely unaware that he was no longer just documenting the show. He was about to become a part of it. The guard's polished shoes clicked closer, each step a countdown, the sound echoing the ticking of a clock that was about to strike. The tension reached its zenith as Sergeant Kalen executed a flawless turn, his body moving with the sharp precision of a machine built for one purpose. He now faced east, his gaze sweeping over the silent crowd before locking onto the source of the disturbance. His eyes, which had appeared distant and unfocused, were now sharp and penetrating. They settled on Mark, who was still fumbling with his phone, a foolish grin plastered on his face. For the first time, Mark felt a prickle of unease, a sudden awareness that he was being watched not by a performer, but by a predator. The guard's stare was devoid of emotion, yet it carried an immense weight, a silent accusation that made the air around Mark feel thin and cold. The other tourists in his group shuffled their feet, their own smiles faltering as they sensed the shift. The silent, one-sided confrontation stretched for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then, the silence was broken. As Sergeant Kalen began his 21-step patrol toward the other end of the mat, his path brought him directly parallel to where Mark and his friends stood. The moment his polished shoe hit the 17th step, directly in front of them, he stopped. It was an unscheduled, unchoreographed halt that sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. He did not turn his head. He did not alter his posture. He simply stopped, a statue of righteous indignation. Then his voice, a deep and resonant baritone that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the plaza, boomed across the space, clear and absolute. It is requested that visitors maintain a state of silence and respect. The words were not a suggestion. They were a command, delivered with the full force of the authority vested in him. The sound was so unexpected, so powerful, that several people in the crowd physically jolted. Mark froze, his phone held limply in his hand. The smirk vanished, from his face replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He was being publicly admonished. Humiliation washed over him, hot and swift, but it was quickly followed by a surge of indignant defiance. Who was this soldier to call him out? He was a paying citizen, a tourist. This was all just a show. "It's just a show," he muttered under his breath, intending for only his friends to hear. But in the profound silence that had followed the guard's announcement, the words carried. He then made a critical error in judgment. He laughed. It wasn't a loud, boisterous laugh like before, but a short, nervous, dismissive chuckle. It was a sound of pure arrogance, a final, foolish act of defiance against an immovable object. He was doubling down on his disrespect, challenging the very foundation of the tomb's sanctity. That was the final line. The laugh, small as it was a gunshot in a library. It was a direct, personal challenge to the guard's authority, and by extension to the honor of the unknown soldiers. Sergeant Kalen, who had remained facing forward, now turned his head with a slow, deliberate motion. The movement was chilling, robotic, and utterly menacing. His eyes, which had been cold before, now burned with a controlled fire. He took one step off the black mat, a move that was strictly forbidden by protocol, except in the most extreme circumstances. That single step was a declaration of intent. The show was over. The reality had begun. He brought his rifle from his shoulder to the port-arms position, a swift, fluid motion that ended with a resounding slap of his hand against the weapon's stock. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. The climax was not a shout, but a command delivered with terrifying calm. The guard's voice dropped, losing its booming projection but gaining a lethal intensity. It was a voice meant for the battlefield, a voice that expected and received instant obedience. Remain still. The order was directed at Mark, but the entire crowd seemed to freeze in place. Mark's friends, who had been inching away, stopped dead. Chloe's phone was still live-streaming, but her hand trembled, the image shaking. The veteran nodded slowly, a grim look of approval on his face. The father shielded his son's eyes, not from disrespect now, but from the sheer intensity of the discipline being dispensed. Mark stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, the foolish bravado having evaporated completely, leaving only raw, exposed fear. He finally understood. This was not a performance. The man in front of him was not an actor. The tomb guard took another deliberate step forward, closing the distance until he was mere inches from Mark. The tourist had to crane his neck to look up at the soldier, who towered over him like a marble monument come to life. The guard did not speak again. He did not need to. His presence was overwhelming, his silence more potent than any threat. He simply stared down at the man who had dared to laugh, his eyes conveying a message that was crystal clear. You have desecrated this hallowed ground, and you are no longer welcome here. The air crackled with unspoken words: duty, honor, sacrifice, respect. Mark felt the weight of them all pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had come for a show, and he had received a lesson that would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. The standoff lasted only a few seconds, but within that sliver of time a profound transformation occurred. Mark, who had arrived as a loud, arrogant tourist, was reduced to a silent, trembling statue. The guard's unblinking stare stripped away his bravado layer by layer, leaving his ignorance and folly exposed for all to see. The silence that enveloped the plaza was no longer just respectful. It was heavy, charged with the consequence of Mark's actions. His friends stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and second-hand shame. Chloe had ended her live stream, her desire for online engagement completely eclipsed by the terrifying reality of the moment. They were no longer participants in a joke. They were witnesses to a sacred boundary being enforced with absolute authority. The lesson was being delivered not just to Mark, but to everyone present. This ground was different, and the rules were immutable. With the same chilling precision he had displayed throughout, Sergeant Kalen took one step back, returning to the edge of the black mat. He shifted his rifle back to his shoulder with a sharp, resonant click. The movement was a dismissal, a final punctuation mark on the encounter. He then turned his head forward, his profile once again becoming the stoic, unreadable mask of the sentinel. Without another word or glance toward the disgraced tourist, he resumed his patrol. 21 steps. The rhythmic sound of his shoes on the stone returned, but it sounded different now. It was heavier, each step a reminder of the authority that had just been wielded. The ceremony, which had been interrupted, was now restored. The guard's actions had surgically removed the cancer of disrespect, allowing the sanctity of the space to heal. As the guard continued his solitary, rhythmic walk, the spell over the crowd broke. Mark's friends, moving with a quiet urgency, grabbed his arm and pulled him away. Mark stumbled along, his eyes still wide with shock, his face ashen. He didn't look back. Their retreat was a stark contrast to their boisterous arrival. Their shoulders were slumped, their heads bowed, and they moved as a single, shamed unit. They melted back into the larger crowd and disappeared toward the exit. Their vacation abruptly and irrevocably altered. The other visitors watched them go, their expressions ranging from pity to grim satisfaction. The father, who had been shielding his son, now placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "You see," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, That is respect, that is honor. The boy nodded, his eyes fixed on the unwavering form of the tomb guard. The incident left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it. The story would be retold, perhaps becoming a minor legend among those who were there, a cautionary tale about the consequences. Though forgetting where you are. The tourists who remained now stood straighter, their silence more profound, their understanding deepened. They watched the remainder of the ceremony with a newfound reverence, every precise movement of the guard, every command from the relief commander, now imbued with a significance they might have previously missed. They had not just seen a ceremony, they had been given a powerful, visceral education in the meaning of the words honor, duty, and sacrifice. They had seen the line between performance and reality, and they had seen what happens when that line is crossed. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, a quiet sense of order and solemnity had been firmly re-established. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the plaza. The veteran with the hat approached the edge of the restricted area, placed his hat back over his heart, and gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the sentinel on duty. It was a silent exchange between two men who understood the language of service, a shared acknowledgement of a duty fulfilled. The tomb guard, continuing his ceaseless patrol, gave no outward sign that he had noticed the gesture, but a sense of mutual respect hung in the air, a quiet understanding that the honor of the unknowns was safe. Sergeant Kalen continued his walk into the fading light, a lone figure of unwavering dedication. His job was done, not just the ceremonial aspect, but the more profound duty of guardianship. He had faced a challenge to the sanctity of the tomb, and had met it with the precise application of discipline and authority. The laughter was gone, replaced by the hallowed silence he was sworn to protect. He was a sentinel, a teacher, a silent enforcer of a sacred trust. As he paced back and forth across the marble, his presence was a powerful, living testament to the fact that this was not a show. It was a solemn promise, kept in perpetuity, a promise that the sacrifices of the fallen would never be forgotten, and their final resting place would forever remain a ground of unparalleled respect.